is your host. Appreciate you being here with us tonight. We have a special guest in the studio discussing a very important book that speaks about defending the traditional definition of marriage. The book is called What is Marriage? A Man and Woman Defense. And with us this evening, the author, a co-author of this book, Sharif Girgis. Sharif, welcome to the program, and thank you for being here with us this evening.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. In the news lately, and certainly the Supreme Court here in the United States is looking to hand down a decision on related to the gay marriage issue. And here on the Coptic Cafe program this evening, we have a lot to cover. Forgive me for jumping right in. I invite you to call in with your questions or post your comments on our Facebook page. The phone number here is 818-342-3388, 818-342-3388, or post your comments on facebook.com/Coptic Cafe. I invite your comments and your questions, and let me turn to the blessed guest in the studio and ask you, Sharif, what prompted you to write this book?
Sure. Well, it was something of an accident at first. One of the authors of it, Robert George, who was a professor of mine at Princeton, was asked to write an op-ed about the marriage issue, and he asked Ryan Anderson, the other co-author, and me to help him with it. We only had 900 words. We went through about 20 drafts to make those 900 words count. And we thought, you know, it'd be nice to stretch our legs with the argument and just to be able to articulate it at greater length. So we drafted something, and it turned out to be 6,000 words, and then by a couple revisions, 12,000. And so we released it as an article. And the article did very well, and so we got to do some talks and debates on the basis of it. And from those talks and debates, really gained a lot of insights into the parts of the article that could have been strengthened, that could have been made more clear, and from that really revamped and expanded the argument into the book that you have now.
Oh, excellent. The book is again available on Amazon.com, and I encourage all people who are interested in the argument to learn how to defend the traditional marriage question. The question, should marriage be redefined? And I'd like to get into the arguments right away with Sharif. Sharif, why marriage cannot be redefined? This is basically the question you're answering in this book. So walk us through, what is a marriage by definition?
Sure. Well, I think you can look at it from one of two angles. You can look at it from the social point of view, what the social value of having an institution of marriage is, and from the personal point of view. And from the social point of view, the thing that gets the state involved, I think, is the social goal of bringing men and women together as husband and wife to be father and mother to any children they might have. And the reason is that based on human experience, and now in the last couple decades based on very good social science research, every alternative that we have studied to that married biological parenting tends to have less good results than that model. To put it more bluntly, we always know that a mom is going to be around when a baby is born. The question is whether the father will be around, and if so, for how long. So marriage as an institution is society's solution to that very common social problem, and the evidence of how common it is that every society that has left us a trace of itself has seen fit to regulate socially and in some cases legally the sexual relationships of men and women. I think from a kind of more internal point of view, marriage is, as it's articulated in our religion, it's a one flesh union. But that concept of one flesh union, in some form or other, and especially its implications, shows up in lots of different traditions of thought. And I think articulating and unpacking that concept, as I think we'll do later in the program, will show why, among other things, marriage is only a kind of relationship possible between a man and a woman.
The Christian defense, obviously, is very clear. when you speak among Christian circles, believers, people who believe in the Bible and in the Scripture, the argument is simple. God created Adam and Eve and meant for them to stay together and go forward and procreate. And the alternative, which would be any kind other than man, woman, is deemed abominable by God in the Scripture. Again, I'm just for now speaking about the Christian argument. And anyone who upholds the Bible as the ultimate authority must submit to these realities, that God created Adam and Eve to procreate and go out and, of course, after the fall. And also God taught us what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. So we get our moral system from God, and we know what is right or wrong from God. Now, we couldn't use this argument with secular people. So if you're in a debate and you start using the Bible and you say St. Paul says this about homosexuality, or the book of Leviticus in the Old Testament from the old time, God speaks about man dressing in woman's clothing and this is forbidden and all of that. This kind of argument is thrown out and not accepted because the person across the table from you does not adhere or believe in the Bible. So how do you overcome this hurdle?
Well, I think that fortunately this issue is not just a specifically religious or theological issue. It's not like fighting over whether we should all fast for 40 days before Easter. That's a specifically religious issue. It's an issue that even by the church's own view is not part of the natural moral law, or not something that we can get from natural moral reasoning. On the other hand, marriage, again, as we said, is something that you find in every society. The idea of it being between a man and a woman is something that you find until just a few decades ago, really, actually in legal terms, just until about 13 years ago, in every time and place, despite all the sociological differences. And that means that it must serve some human goods, and not just specifically Christian goods. And you can start to examine what those might be. And I think that from there you can get the argument rolling. And one way to begin is just to critically examine what the main argument for redefining marriage is. So that argument usually depends on equality. Mm-hmm. It's the idea that everyone is born equal, and if everybody's born equal and marriage is a good thing, then marriage should be available to everybody equally. And the fact is that equality by itself doesn't get you a single inch towards any policy conclusion about what marriage should be. And the reason for that is that equality just says to recognize marriage equally. But to do that, you have to first know what marriage is. I mean, the fact that we're all in all kinds of relationships, to relatives, to siblings, to best friends, to roommates, that the state does not recognize as marriages, and that nobody thinks it a violation of equality for them not to be recognized. And the reason is that everybody agrees that they're just not marriages. So before you can say that a particular relationship which isn't being recognized is for all intents and purposes the same thing as a marriage, you have to know what marriage is. And that's a question that the proponents of redefining marriage almost never answer.
So your argument is not lending any factors from the Christian argument. So that way you're able to discuss this with anyone who is an atheist, who is not Christian. The arguments are outside of the Christian teachings.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, because I think, you can't just argue from tradition. The fact that something has always been a certain way doesn't mean that it should always be that way. And again, even if you gave an argument from Christianity, there would still be an interesting question, which is why did all these other societies, pre-Christian societies, why did all these thinkers who had no connection to Judaism or Christianity, and like in ancient Greece and Rome, not just Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, but Xenophanes and Musonius Rufus and Plutarch and so on, why did they have similar visions of marriage? They must have been grasping some other insight that at least we can uncover and examine. And on the other hand, I think you can argue against the main vision of marriage behind the proposals to redefine, again, without appealing to the scriptures, and even without appealing to the moral status of same-sex relationships. I think this is a prior question even to that.
Okay.
So
I want to get into that, but before we do, let me throw this example just to make sure I'm following you along. To make it illegal for interracial marriages, that's inequality. But to allow interracial marriages to be equal to same-race marriage and all of that, that's equality. In other words, for the longest time, a black couldn't marry a white. That's inequality. Now, to pass a law that says every marriage is treated equal, that means you accept an interracial marriage versus an ordinary marriage. That's equality, right? But a man marrying a man or a woman marrying a woman is not an equality issue?
well, the reason that we know that bans on interracial marriages were violations of equality is that we know that race has nothing to do with what makes a marriage. In other words,
Race.
we're starting with a view about what makes a marriage, and from which it's obvious that race is just totally arbitrary. It has no connection to that. And that's why it's wrong, it's unjust, it's immoral to say that, to exclude these relationships from a marriage law. But the question in this debate is exactly whether sex differences can make a difference with respect to marriage. If you'd think that they can't, you must have a vision of marriage. And that vision of marriage is mainly of an emotional union, a companionship, a form of making someone else your number one person in life. And it's true, if that's what marriage is, then not only is race irrelevant, but so is sex difference. So is sex difference irrelevant. And then, from that point of view, it really is a violation of equality not to recognize the relationship of two men.
Basically, you're saying if marriage, the definition of marriage is two people loving each other, then we couldn't stop the redefining of marriage, because indeed, to not allow gay marriages is to say it's not two people loving each other.
Right, but here's the problem, is that marriage can't just be about an emotional union.
Why not?
Because there are other things that nobody disputes are part of what make a marriage that have, again, nothing to do necessarily with emotional union. So, for example, the idea that marriage is pledged to permanence. That, other forms of friendship, you don't have to have a very formal or final commitment, but to get a marriage off the ground, you have to have a permanent commitment. Well, if what makes a marriage is a certain kind of emotional union or intensity or priority, then there's no reason of principle to pledge permanence. I mean, any more than there is to pledge commitment for as long as love lasts, for as long as that emotional union lasts. Or the idea of sexual exclusivity. Most people think that in order to make it a marriage, as opposed to some other form of relationship, there needs to be a pledge of sexual exclusivity. But again, if what makes the marriage is emotional union, for some couples, depending on their temperament or taste, a pledge of exclusivity might serve that, but for some, it might hinder that. And yet most people still agree that whatever else is true, a marriage involves a pledge of exclusivity. Even the idea that marriage is a union of two people, you can't make sense of if you see marriage as emotional union. Because three people, three men, for example, can all have deep emotional bond, can all care about the other, want to prioritize the other two over anyone else, that want to avoid the stigma of not being in a recognized relationship or the stigma for any children they might rear in their household together. In other words, everything that seems to make a marriage different would be just as arbitrary as sexual complementarity or race if what makes a marriage is emotional union. So we know that that view of what makes a marriage must be wrong. It basically says there's no difference between marriage and companionship in general.
Okay. Let's get into what is marriage then. Before, let me take a station break on Identify. You're watching a Coptic Cafe program on Logos TV. Thank you for being here with us tonight. We are discussing the book, a new book out is called What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense. And the book is written by the co-author Sharif Girgis, who's here in the studio with us, and we're very blessed to have him. We are very proud to have such a young man to be this with clarity, thinking with clarity, and the ability to write such a book. And we would like to arm all of our blessed viewers with the real issue at hand. It's not simply who are we to judge two people loving each other. There's much more involved than this. So let me move forward and ask you, what is the definition of marriage as you can come up with?
Sure. Well, I described briefly the kind of from the social perspective what the social purpose of the institution is. But from the internal perspective, I said that it would involve analyzing, or one tradition has captured it by the concept of one flesh union, but that's not the only tradition that has captured this idea. And in the book we describe marriage as a comprehensive union. We say that in every dimension that makes any form of community at all, the community that we know as marriage is comprehensive. So what does that mean? Well, I think any community is a matter of common action. It's activity towards common ends in the context of a commitment. And in those three ways, the union of the partners through an activity, the ends that they're united around, and the commitment that their relationship requires, marriage is comprehensive. It's a union of heart, mind, and body. And bodily union means coordinating together towards a single bodily end of the whole that they make up together. That only happens between a man and a woman in the marital act. It's the comprehensive ends. What does that mean? Well, marriage is enriched not just by sports, like a baseball team, not just by rehearsal and plays, like a drama troupe, but the whole range of activities that you might share in home life and in family life. And the reason is that marriage itself points to and is deepened or fulfilled by the bearing and rearing of whole new life, because the act that makes marital love also makes new life. And again, that's something that's true only of the relationship of a man and a woman. And because of those things, because it makes them one flesh, if you want to use the religious terminology, though there are many other traditions that express this idea, because it makes them one flesh in a union at all levels, heart, mind, and body, and because that bodily union orients their relationship to the bearing and rearing of new children, and therefore to the sharing of family life that you would need to develop people in every respect, it also calls for a comprehensive commitment, permanent and exclusive. And this vision, again, is reflected in not just the Judeo-Christian tradition, but in many Eastern religions. Gandhi has a very similar vision of what makes a marriage. It's reflected not just in religious traditions, but in philosophical ones like the ones I mentioned earlier. And it's reflected not just in those kind of intellectual traditions in general, but in our common law, in the law that we inherited from England, and in the law of ancient Greece and Rome. So that's the vision, comprehensive union, a union at all levels oriented to a broad sharing of life through family life that makes a marriage. It explains permanence, it explains exclusivity, it explains the idea that marriage is only two people, and it explains why the state gets involved at all.
Okay, one objection here, you say that a product of the proper definition of marriage is to create new life. Well, not all married couples create new life. Also, any couple may adopt, have a new life one way or another. What would you respond?
Sure. Well, on the vision of marriage that we're discussing here, on what you might call the conjugal view of marriage, a couple has a comprehensive union. A couple can become one flesh. They can extend the union of heart and mind along the bodily dimension. The union that seals their love is also the kind of union that makes new life. whether we're talking about on their wedding night, or before their first child comes, or after the last child goes off to college, or indeed if they never have children. They still have that comprehensive union that makes it a marriage, as opposed to a union of hearts and minds, as opposed to just a form of companionship. And because of that, recognizing their relationships doesn't teach a different vision of marriage. It doesn't teach that marriage is something else, like recognizing same-sex relationships would. In fact, it does teach us something that's valuable to teach, which is that this kind of comprehensive union is valuable in itself. It's not just a tool for boosting kids' SAT scores. It's something that's valuable in itself, and that's something that it's valuable for couples to live by. In the question of adoption, we have to keep in mind that, well, we have two questions here, right? I mean, so one thing is what relationships to recognize as a marriage. It's a separate policy question, perhaps, which kinds of arrangements to allow to adopt. And on the second question, I think here the social science that we have gives us some hints. And it suggests that, again, every time we've compared married biological parenting to an alternative, the farther away from that we've gotten, in general, on average, the more difficult the situation is for children. And so with adoption, even if we don't limit adoption just to married people, so for example, perhaps a grandparents or a grandparent can adopt a child if the parents die, something like that, we do want to approximate the ideal whenever possible. We know that kids need both a mom and a dad, that they have different benefits and have different difficulties based on whether it's a mother or a father that's absent. So in those cases, we're going to try to meet the ideal. And as long as that's possible in practice, it should be pursued. So I don't think either the possibility of adoption or the existence of infertile couples really undermines this vision of what makes a marriage.
Okay. You're watching the Coptic Cafe program on Logos TV. Thank you for being here with us tonight. With us, Sharif Girgis, a co-author of the book, What is Marriage? I invite you to call us here at the studio. We're taping live now. It's 818-342-3388. I welcome your questions. Any challenges that you hear or you face and you are not able to answer regarding this issue, I invite you to call in and ask. I'm going to move on, Sharif, but I reserve the right to go back and present more objections, because I'd like to be able to address as many points as we can. We have about a half hour left in the program, by the way, so I don't know if that's enough or not, but I want to make sure you bring in your major points to the puzzle. The next thing is, what is the harm of redefining marriage? You touched up on what marriage is, but are you really saying that the union should just be between two people, not three, not four, not five? Or is there harm?
So this is a frequent question, because people can say, look, even if you're right that the more traditional view makes better sense of these other features of what makes a marriage than the emotional companionship view does, who cares? We have the choice. A lot of people want us to change the law. What's the big deal? I mean, it's not going to affect you or your marriage. And I think that kind of objection ignores the importance of culture. The law teaches. It shapes culture. It shapes our beliefs, and our beliefs shape practice. And if we enshrine in the law a vision of marriage that says that it's primarily about adult emotional fulfillment, at least more than it is about the particular needs of children, if we enshrine the idea that it's about emotional union and satisfaction, if we enshrine the idea that moms and dads are perfectly replaceable, then it's going to undermine over time people's motivations to live out permanence and exclusivity and so on. The very norms, the stabilizing norms that make marriage useful for family life and therefore for the common good. In other words, if from day one you grow up in a society that's been telling you that, a dad doesn't contribute anything distinctive to what makes a marriage, and that marriage is primarily about emotional satisfaction, then it's going to be harder for you to see the point of maintaining sexual exclusivity when it has emotional costs, of maintaining permanence when the emotion has died down or has wandered to someone else, or of the idea of sticking with it for the sake of the kids, because after all, you've been imbibing the idea that dads don't contribute anything special to what makes a marriage. And so the prominence of those ideas, and the more they get absorbed, which they will, that's the whole point of enshrining them in the law, the lower our motivations will be to stick by the stabilizing norms of marriage. And that's going to undermine the very goods that get the state involved in marriage in the first place, which again are basically the very good outcomes that it produces, not just for children's health, but for their education, for their socialization, for crime rates, and you name it, of being reared wherever possible by their own mother and father in a committed relationship.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about parenting. You mentioned one of the things that could be harmful is the fact that we neglect or not recognize the value that a father contributes or a mother contributes. How do you see parenting as a hindrance or a proof of the need for marriage to remain between a man and a woman?
Good. Well, so one of the things that often comes up in this realm is the idea that, well, either people will say, we don't really have good studies on this question, or they'll say, we do, but they all point in the other direction. And they say there are no differences between opposite and same-sex parenting. All you really need is two people and love and two sources of income and so on. And, well, let's take them one by one. On the first point, we do have extensive evidence from more than a generation of social science, of studies that have been replicated and repeated and so on, that compares married biological parenting to non-biological parenting, to step parenting, which does involve two incomes and two sources of love and commitment and so on, certainly to single parenting and to joint custody after divorce, though those are farther away from the ideal even. And in every case where we have national representative samples that are studied over time longitudinally, we find that married biological does better. There are no significant indicators where any of the alternatives do better than married biological, and many in which it does better than them. So first thing is, it would be a huge surprise if it turned out that there was an exception to that general pattern with same-sex parenting. And it would be a surprise for two reasons. Again, one is the idea that we see distinctive contributions from mothers and fathers, and the second reason is that we see a distinctive difference with a biological connection. You can speculate about why that is, but we know that in general it's there. In fact, social scientists have a name for it called kin altruism. But on the second point, on the idea that the studies are already there on same-sex parenting and that they show that there's no big deal here, I would refer your viewers and listeners to a paper by a professor named Loren Marks, Loren Marks, in Social Science Research. Professor Marks looked at the 59 studies that the American Psychological Association relied on when it said that there are no differences here. And what he found was that none of them had the gold standard of methodology in this area. I think only one of the 59 was even a large and representative sample. None of them were studied longitudinally. They didn't have the basic features that make these kinds of things replicable. Most of them depended on snowball sampling, which means you put up a poster in like a bookstore or something, and then people sign up for the study and they get their friends to sign up, so they were all in a particular demographic. They mostly involved self-reporting by the parents rather than examining the outcomes for children when they had grown up, and so on. And they in many cases compared same-sex parenting to other kinds of parenting that we already knew were less than optimal, so single parenting and so on. We have one study so far that is large and representative and that waited until the children had grown up and asked about their outcomes looking back. And that study, and it looked at 9 different family forms, I think, including children, at least one of whose parents had had a same-sex relationship during their upbringing. And it found, guess what, the same pattern that we had found with every other thing that we had studied with more reliable methods, which is that there were many of the 40 indicators that this study looked at, children did worse in these other parenting models rather than married biological.
Let me side the track for a minute and speak about studies. Sometimes the most commonsensical thing is put up for studies and evaluations, and you could potentially get some studies that are opposite to common sense. For example, maybe about a year ago or a little bit over, the fiasco about the global warming studies and how the original studies that were cited by every subsequent study was naming, and then when they wanted to go back to the original studies to verify what was reported, they ran into a stone wall, and then in the end they found all these emails fabricating some of the numbers and all of that. Studies can be fabricated. It would be a grave mistake on society's part to change a 2,000-year-old understanding or custom based on some studies that could have been manipulated by some dishonest people.
Well, I think what's definitely true is that the social science is always at the risk of being politicized. Some people would say it's always inherently political, that it's very difficult because you've got to make all kinds of assumptions. When you say you're controlling for variables, you have to decide which variables to control for and what controlling for them means in practice. There are all kinds of decisions that have to be made at all levels in order to make a study. And so you're right that at least we have to be very cautious of the way that we use them. And before we upend an institution that is actually much longer than 2,000 years, and not just in the West, yeah, you're right. I think the kinds of evidence we would need would be substantial, would be over many replications, and would be just the kinds of evidence that we just simply don't have articulating a no difference thesis. So I think you're right that if caution points in any direction, it certainly points against redefinition at this stage. The other point I would make is that sometimes there are kinds of benefits and values that we can talk about that aren't empirically measured, or that we don't need a study to measure. So, for example, there's a non-Christian philosopher at New York University named David Velleman. I think he may be Jewish, but I'm not sure about that. I don't want to assert that he is. But he's by no means some kind of like radical conservative or reactionary conservative. And he says that one of the benefits of marriage is connecting people to their biological heritage, and that it's an important part of forming your own identity, whether by association or by distancing, to be able to know your biological heritage. That's something that you can claim. It's a clear connection to biological parenting in particular, and you don't need a study to tell you that it's connected to biological parenting. And you can debate about what the value of it is. I think Professor Velleman's arguments for its value are very good. And you can debate about that without having an empirical study to show it to you. And I think it points clearly in one direction. And in fact, Professor Velleman, at least as last I heard, which was I think 2 or 3 years ago, was against redefining marriage for precisely this reason, that it would now introduce the idea not just of by accident or tragedy or difficulty some kids not knowing their own mother and father, but now by deliberation and by choice and by encouragement from society. And again, you can look at every stage of his argument without appeal to a study. It's just a claim about what's inherently valuable.
I bring that point because sometimes our teachings at the church are dismissed by some of the college students or the youth simply because they were introduced to a study, or their professor told them, well, we thought all along that this and that, but there's a study, and then you dig deeper, and the study is of 150 people, random samples, and it's hardly representative of the 300 million that lives in the state.
I think that's right, and again, as I said, that's been a particular problem for the particular issue we're talking about, in part because it's very hard to find large samples that are representative of same-sex couples. In order to get a sample that's big enough that the number of same-sex couples within it is very significant, you have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, basically.
And a long, long time.
And
to
a very
see
long time.
These kids growing up in this environment.
Exactly. And the study that I mentioned, which is by Mark Rigneris, is the closest that we've gotten so far. And it's far and away the closest as compared with the alternatives. And insofar as it gives us any hint so far, it points in the opposite direction.
Okay. Another side point, because I think I have a little bit of time. You mentioned, and I agree, by the way, that laws shape culture and societies. My question is, who is in charge of legislating laws? Because you have something like Proposition 8 here in the state of California. This was up to vote, and the majority of Californians said yes, meaning to keep marriage between man and a woman. And then, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was 61% to 38 or 37, something like that. But then it was challenged, and the Supreme Court is due to render a decision in the next week or so. You have divided opinions, and will go forward by the majority. The majority will vote. I fear the day when, the majority, like a statistic that was mentioned on the news, that there's a shift between the people supporting gay marriages today in the 21st century versus, just 50 years ago, and it's a dramatic shift. So, whose morals get to be dictated?
Yeah, well, that's in some ways the central question when you get down to it in practice about what our marriage law is going to be. One thing that you bring up is the role of the Supreme Court. I think it's pretty clear that whatever is right in this case, the Constitution does not settle it. It doesn't require traditional marriage. It doesn't forbid traditional marriage, because there's nothing in the Constitution about marriage. Now, some people will say, sure, but there's something in it about equality, and that settles it. Well, we've already seen that equality by itself isn't going to get you an inch. You first have to have a substantive view of what is marriage, of what's being recognized on an equal basis, before you can say that equality is violated. And that's something that you just can't pull out of the Constitution. You've got to have a substantive argument. And that's why I think this kind of decision doesn't belong in the courts. It belongs with the people. Now, on the question of what direction the people are taking, it's true that the trend is for redefinition right now, but it's not nearly as inevitable, it's certainly not inevitable in the way that people think that it is. Most people bring up 2012 as a bad year for traditional marriage, and in some ways it was. But in May of 2012, it was just a few months ago, a swing state, North Carolina, which went for Obama in 2008, went 61-39 for traditional marriage. And not just for traditional marriage, but even against civil unions and other forms of recognition for same-sex couples. That was just a few months ago. Now, if this debate were really over, if it were really finished, then you wouldn't have 41 states upholding the traditional view. You wouldn't have North Carolina, swing state, and a very important state, going for the traditional view in such a strong way by such strong numbers. Even in November, which is supposed to be the worst month for traditional marriage, and indeed, on 4 ballots, traditional marriage lost. In every one of those states, it did significantly better than the Romney-Ryan ticket, which stood for fiscal conservatism. Nobody thinks the fiscal conservatism is dead, and yet they want to pronounce traditional marriage dead. I think it really doesn't, there's nothing inevitable. History has no mind. We're not riding some inevitable wave towards a predetermined conclusion. The future is chosen. And how we choose, which future we're going to choose on this particular issue, depends on whether we're willing to make the arguments now. That's, I think, the biggest question. Are traditional people on this issue going to be intimidated into silence, intimidated by the accusations of bigotry and violations of equality and so on? Or are they going to say, no, this view is perfectly consistent with the equal dignity of every human being. There are good reasons for holding this view, and we're going to articulate those reasons and act on them.
I'm going to get to how to avoid challenges posed by the other side in a little bit. But you brought up this point where someone feels like their view may be lacking compassion. If two people love each other, what's the point? and you made it clear as to this should not be legislated by the state, by the government. We're certainly for the right teachings of the Lord, and when the Lord tells us good is good and evil is evil, so be it. So we're not forcing people to abstain or stop immoral behaviors. Everybody has free choice, and Christians tend to offer the Christian teachings, and it's up to anyone to take it. We certainly don't hold the sword to anybody's neck and say accept or you shall die. So if somebody is feeling false compassion, that maybe they are not doing the Christian thing, especially this argument was used by supporters of gay marriages against me. I had a group of young people walking down the street, and they saw that we had signs supporting Prop 8, and they just they were not part of the church, they were from the street, and they said, you're a hypocrite. How can you teach about love and compassion and mercy and not allow two people who are in love with each other? What would you say to help someone formulate an argument?
Sure. Well, I think usually the question already betrays a mistake. How can you not let people live as they choose? In fact, in all 50 states, as you alluded to, everyone is free to form a relationship, to form a sexual relationship with someone of the same sex, to call it a marriage, to have their religious community call it one, to have their employer recognize it as one, and so on. If freedom points in any direction here, it's really in the direction of the status quo, because if same-sex relationships are recognized as marriages, it's not going to permit new people to have the relationships they want. It's going to force people of a traditional mind in various ways to treat these relationships precisely as a marriage. So the coercion is only going in that direction, I think. To point of contrast, bigamy in this country is banned. In most states, you can go to jail for trying to contract a second marriage. You can't go to jail for your consensual sexual choices, and so that's one thing. But the second thing is that usually people who make the compassion argument are motivated by an important point, which is that everybody needs a deep form of community. Everybody needs companionship. They need people that they can trust, that they can seek advice from, that they can share important experiences with. And that's absolutely right, and there's nothing in the gospel against that idea. And in fact, the whole gospel is a proposal of the deepest kind of companionship possible, which is companionship with the Lord who made you and who knows the number of hairs on your head, and so on. So companionship is something that we're for. We're for compassion. We're for true love. But the idea that in order to have real companionship, you have to have a sexual relationship is part of the problem here. That's why people think that to deny marriage is simply to say that people have something less. But the Christian view, the more traditional view of marriage, says no, marriage is something different. It's not more, it's not simply the most of what makes any relationship value, it's something different. It has specific ends and specific contours and specific norms. And outside of that, you can have companionship, even without a sexual relationship. You can have deep emotional union. You can have self-disclosure. You can have mutual reliance, and all of the kinds of things that people are really concerned about when they say, Christianity is about love. How can you deny love?
You're watching the Coptic Cafe program here on Logos TV. Thank you for being here with us this evening. We have a special episode discussing the marriage and the efforts to redefine marriage from the traditional sense of being between man and a woman to be something else. And we're blessed to have in the studio a very fine young man who has co-authored a book called What is Marriage? A Man and Woman Defense. And we're discussing together the various objections that come up and what the frame of the debate should be about the definition of marriage, because if we understand what it means, what marriage, what the word defines in a culture setting, in a governmental setting, then the issue can be clarified. At least we will be clear on what we're talking about. But as long as some groups have a separate meaning in mind, marriage is basically two people who are feel affectionate towards each other, is very different from the real sense of marriage that has been propagated by societies throughout the ages. Sharif, we have about 15 minutes, so I want to make sure I bring you input all the points you want to share with us to summarize the fine arguments you have in the book. I want to ask you, religious liberty. You mentioned that the freedom really lies on the side of upholding what marriage is, but then forcing those who have moral convictions and so on to accept other unions. Would you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, as I was saying, that if equality is the argument for redefining marriage, and again, I think we've seen that it doesn't actually get you there, but it's the main thing that's used to argue for that conclusion. There's a clear implication, which is that anybody who has the traditional view on marriage is holding on to an irrational view, is a bigot, and is basically the equivalent of a racist, morally speaking. And what do we do with racists in our society? Well, we don't jail them, because there is the First Amendment in the United States Constitution, but we do everything short of that to marginalize them from public life. People can lose their jobs because of expressing racist views. Institutions that are racist will be denied all kinds of civil benefits and be penalized in all sorts of ways and lose their tax-exempt status, and you name it. We do everything we can to marginalize them. Now, if it turns out that anyone who has the traditional view of marriage isn't the equivalent of that, which is the lesson that's taught by redefining marriage, then that apparatus of marginalization, of exclusion, of civil penalties in all sorts of ways will be aimed at the churches. And it's just not enough to say that, well, we're gonna try to preserve our own freedom to live as we choose, and that'll be the end of it. Because again, the option is not neutrality or the Christian view. The option is the traditional vision of marriage, which is shared by other communities, or a vision that's opposed to it and that says that the traditional view is bigotry. And we already see examples of this to make it concrete. I mean, Catholic charities in Massachusetts and in Illinois and in other areas where you've seen all kinds of legislation in this area have, in some cases, been forced to close down because the state has given them an ultimatum. Either you give up this bigoted view and you offer children to same-sex as well as opposite-sex couples on an equal basis, or
you shut down.
Now, that's just, you can cry religious liberty all you want, but when the religious liberty is for something that the state has deemed bigotry, it's going to be a very uphill battle. And that's just what we've seen in practice. We've seen hundreds of cases of this. The Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty has documented lots of them. And we're going to see more of them. Because, again, there's no neutral ground here. You're enshrining one view of marriage or not, or the other. And one of those views will call the other bigotry.
What do you think is a real, if there's anything else, I mean, you've already shared your views on this, but why the push to change? There are civil unions that are recognized. I've heard arguments that loved ones need to have legal stand when their loved one is dying or passing away for inheritance reasons or tax reasons, and health insurance if you're in a domestic relationship and you're working, your partner should be covered. All of these things are covered by civil unions. Why push to redefine the word marriage?
Good. Well, actually, I have some experience with this particular question because one of my co-authors and I, Ryan Anderson and I, once made a proposal. We said, look, it's true that there are some practical needs that it may not make sense to limit to married couples, to couples that are traditionally married, you could say. Hospital visitation rights, I think, is the most obvious example of this. If two people have lived together, if they've shared a common home and that common stock of memories and sympathies that comes with that, then sure, it makes sense to allow them to see each other in illness. But there's no reason to limit that to sexual partners. If a brother and sister have lived together their whole lives, they're adults, they live in a jurisdiction where you can only visit in the hospital if you're a parent-child or if you're a spouse, it seems like they should be allowed to, even though they don't have a sexual relationship. There's no reason that would apply to the sexual case but not them. And so we made a proposal and we said, look, most of the time, most of these benefits can be arranged by power of attorney, by private means. But if there are some cases where, in practice, what you need is a publicly available kind of package of benefits and possibilities, then sure, make that available, but make it available without a presumption of a sexual relationship. Make it available to two brothers as well as to two men in love, and so on and so forth. And immediately the answer from the leading proponents of same-sex marriage that we were in a kind of dialogue with came back, and it was no. And the reason is that in addition to the concern about these kind of practical needs being met, people on the other side of this issue also care about what is marriage. They care about what vision of marriage society is going to teach and enshrine in the law. They want a different vision of marriage to be enshrined, and if you make some benefits available even without a sexual relationship, then you're not going to be doing that anymore. You're not going to be changing the society's definition of marriage, and that is their goal. So I think on both sides, that becomes really the central question. Are we going to use the law to enshrine a vision of marriage that can explain its stabilizing norms and its connection to the common good and therefore can support those goods in practice? Or are we going to use it to change society's traditional moral views and to upend them and to discourage them from being taught and to teach their opposite, both through the law and through non-discrimination policies and through the educational curricula and so on. So it's really a battle about that moral question and that moral vision and not just the practical benefits.
We pray. We pray because I will say this is my own opinion, of course. I see a certain kind of arrogance on the part of people to say 7,000, 8,000 years of civilizations were wrong, and I know better, and it should be this way. When you say something like that, then people come back with the argument that says, well, if you think all things should remain the same, slavery was acceptable in the old times. What would you answer?
Well, it's true that there have been bad things that were widespread socially, and that's why I've made an argument for this one. That's why I think you can look at the reasons behind the tradition and examine those reasons, and you can compare them to the reasons behind the alternative vision and see which one holds up better. So we're not just relying on tradition. Tradition may be a strong evidence, but it's not conclusive. That's right. And when it's not conclusive, you got to make arguments about the reasons behind the traditions. And that's where I think the revisionist view, the view of the people who want to redefine marriage, does no better. It's not like slavery, where you examine the premises, the idea in Aristotle that there are natural slaves, that there are people that are naturally inferior. I think that just collapses when you look at the arguments, and or the idea, I think, that, for example, that committing certain kinds of crimes can make you forfeit your humanity. You're no longer really a person. You're more like a beast or something. And I think that just breaks down when you look at it. But the ideas behind the tradition for marriage don't break down. In fact, they hold up much better than the alternative. And that's the burden of the book, and that's the argument that we make. And especially on the negative aspect of the argument, on the challenges to the new vision of marriage, to explain the less controversial features of marriage, like permanence and exclusivity and monogamy, I think we haven't heard a single good rebuttal.
Okay, Sharif, we have 5 minutes left. And I want you to address how to avoid challenges posed by the other side. What would your recommendation be or advice?
Sure. Well, one thing is you have to be careful how the conversation is framed. Usually, if you see the argument as one about whether to expand or restrict the pool of people eligible to marry, it looks like we should expand. I mean, marriage is a good thing. If some people aren't allowed in it, that's a bad thing, so we should allow them in it. What's the argument against it? But that obscures, again, what we've been saying is the real question behind the question about eligibility for marriage, which is what vision of marriage are we enshrining in the law? And the other thing I would say is that the most common mistake that people of a traditional mind on this issue make is to think that on their side they have to paint a whole picture of what marriage is and explain all the exceptions and explain the boundaries of which relationships count as marriages and justify leaving every other kind of relationship out of it. And then the other side, all they have to do is try to poke a hole in that argument. Well, when that's the fight, it's not a fair fight. So what you've got to do is get other people. This isn't a tactic. This isn't a kind of trick. This is just fairness. This is just the only way to really compare the views, is to get them both on the table. Say, what is your vision? I know that you think same-sex relationships count. Why don't 3 men count? Why don't temporary unions count? Mexico City looked at a proposal to recognize 2-year renewable marriage licenses, like a contract, like a lease. Why doesn't that count? Why should marriage be permanent? Get someone to articulate their own vision of marriage, and then you can compare the two and see which one makes better sense of the things that we both agree are critical to what makes a marriage. If that's the challenge, then you're going to be on much better footing, and I think that in every case where the full views really are compared on the table in the clear light of day, the traditional view will do better. At least I haven't found a counterexample yet. But again, when you're in the defensive position, when all you're doing is trying to defend a huge wall and the other person just has to poke one hole in it, then it's going to be much harder.
Thank you very much, Sharif. You've been watching the Coptic Cafe program on Logos TV. Thank you for being here with us this evening. We were discussing a book co-authored by Sharif Girgis called What is Marriage? Sharif, before we go, I have like 2 minutes left. What would be the single most important thing you'd like to leave the viewers with?
Sure. Well,
summarize or
just
to
a kind of encouragement,
something
really.
that we didn't get to discuss.
I guess the single most important thing is the website for the book, which is whatismarriagebook.com, or its availability on Amazon. But in a slightly more serious vein, I think it would be a kind of encouragement. Most people who have a traditional view on this issue are not just in a defensive position intellectually, but kind of emotionally and morally as well. They're wondering, am I really supporting human equality? Am I really being compassionate here? And I want to say, I've looked really hard at the arguments of the different positions, and I think the answer is yes, and I'd encourage you to read up, to face the toughest challenges on the other side, and to see that I think at the end of the day they don't hold up.
What was the toughest challenge, real quick, that you faced from your debates and going around the country?
Well, I think the toughest challenge is not so much a kind of intellectual or abstract one. It's just,
emotional.
And emotional sounds like it's denigrating, and I'm not really denigrating. I'm just saying it's a kind of gut reaction. It's like people want companionship, and why are you holding them back? And what's ironic is that most powerful challenge is also the one that's easiest to answer. And the answer is companionship is great, and this is not blocking anyone from companionship. And in fact, once you get clear about how the vision of marriage is quite specific, and it's about what makes marriage different from other forms of companionship, you see that it actually encourages the idea that we can seek companionship and closeness also in other forms of relationship, that's not all that makes a marriage, so that it's unacceptable to seek closeness to someone outside of it. And that really undercuts the single most powerful argument for same-sex marriage, and from there I think it's easier to look at the intellectual merits of each view in a more sober way.
Thank you very much, Sharif. We've come to the end of the show, and it was a great pleasure to have you with us and discuss the book. What is Marriage is the name of the book, and whatismarriage.com is the website. The book is available on Amazon.com, and I'd like to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Number one, as we spoke earlier, laws shape cultures and societies and civilizations at large. So it's important how you vote. Your vote in this country counts, and make it count towards the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. The second point is to simply examine the teachings of God, because these are the true teachings. Christ says, I am the truth. And if we are really interested in the truth, we should simply search it and research it in the scriptures. Yes, other people may not accept the scripture as a resource or as an authority, but it is enough for us. And we can deepen our relationship with Christ, and this is the very basic of the Christian teachings. Christ says, if you love anyone more than me, father, mother, husband, wife, son, daughter, brother, sister, more than me, you don't deserve me. Because our relationships with other people will be modeled after our relationship with God. So if we can love, we have to love God first so we can have pure love. If we have compassion and mercy, we need to examine that in our own relationship with God in order to be able to deal it to other people that we deal with. You've been watching the Coptic Cafe program on Logos TV. Thank you very much for being here with us this evening. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Good night.